My name is Aline, and at 28 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing in my grandmother's Victorian house clutching eviction papers my own parents had filed against me. Right now, they're on my porch screaming so loud the whole neighborhood can hear, demanding I sign over the deed to the only real home I've ever known. My mother just threw a brick through the front window as police sirens wail in the distance. What they didn't know was that I'd already discovered their secret about Grandma's death. Before I dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and greed, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's dealt with toxic family members trying to steal your inheritance? Hit that like button if you believe family isn't always blood, and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up to manipulation. Trust me, what happened next will leave you speechless. 6 months before that terrifying confrontation, my world changed forever, when my grandmother Rose passed away peacefully in her sleep, or so we all thought at the time. She was 87 years old and had lived in that beautiful Victorian house on Maple Street for over 50 years, filling every room with memories of love and laughter. The house itself was a stunning 3-story masterpiece worth $800,000 with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that had witnessed countless family gatherings over the decades. The day of the will reading arrived on a cold January morning, and my entire family gathered in the lawyer's office downtown, everyone dressed in black and trying to look appropriately somber while secretly calculating their expected windfall. My parents, Harold and Beatrice, sat in the front row, with barely concealed anticipation, having already started discussing renovations for their own home, using what they assumed would be their substantial inheritance. My younger sister Alicia perched beside them, scrolling through her phone, and occasionally showing our mother pictures of luxury cars she had her eye on. When Mr. Pemberton, grandmother's lawyer of 30 years, cleared his throat and began reading the will, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. To my beloved granddaughter, Aline Marie Henderson, I leave my house at 427 Maple Street and all its contents with the hope that she will fill it with the same love and warmth that has blessed its walls for generations. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap as every head in the room swiveled to stare at me in shock. My hands trembled as Mr. Pemberton continued reading, explaining that Alicia would receive $50,000 in cash, a generous sum by any measure, while my parents would inherit only grandmother's personal items, including jewelry, photographs, and furniture not attached to the house. The silence that followed was deafening until my mother's sharp intake of breath broke the spell, and my father's face turned an alarming shade of purple as he struggled to maintain his composure in the lawyer's office. "There must be some mistake," my father said through gritted teeth, his voice barely controlled as he leaned forward in his chair. Rose always said the house would stay in the immediate family line, and as her son, I naturally assumed that meant Beatrice and me. But Mr. Pemberton simply shook his head and produced a video recording that grandmother had made just 3 months before her death, sitting in her favorite armchair and speaking directly to the camera with remarkable clarity and determination. In the video, grandmother explained her decision with the same no-nonsense attitude she'd carried throughout her life. "I've watched how each of you treats others when you think no one is looking," her recorded voice said, filling the sterile office with unexpected warmth. "Aline has shown kindness, integrity, and genuine love not just to me, but to everyone she meets, while others in this family have shown their true colors through their greed and manipulation." The camera captured her knowing smile as she added, "This house needs someone who will cherish it, not sell it to the highest bidder." After the initial shock wore off and we left the lawyer's office, my parents' facade of supportive acceptance lasted exactly as long as it took to reach the parking lot. "We need to talk about this reasonably," my mother said, gripping my arm with unexpected force. "You're only 28, sweetheart, far too young to handle the responsibility of maintaining such a large property, and think of the property taxes alone that will drain your savings within a year." But I had already made my decision the moment I heard grandmother's words. 2 weeks later, I moved into the house with just a few boxes of belongings and a heart full of bittersweet memories. As I unpacked in what had been grandmother's bedroom, I discovered her collection of journals dating back decades, filled with her elegant handwriting, documenting not just daily events, but disturbing patterns of behavior from my parents that I had been too young or too blind to see. The first manipulation attempt came just 3 days after I'd settled in, when my parents arrived unannounced with a folder full of real estate listings and a calculator. "We've run the numbers," my father announced, spreading papers across grandmother's antique dining table, as if he owned the place. "If you sell now while the market's hot, you could clear $700,000 after taxes and fees, enough to set yourself up for life if you invest wisely." When I asked what he meant by investing wisely, my mother jumped in with practiced ease, suggesting they could help manage the funds through a special account that would require their signatures for any withdrawals, purely for my protection, of course. The word "no" had barely left my lips when my mother's entire demeanor changed, tears suddenly streaming down her face as she clutched her chest dramatically. "How can you be so selfish when we're struggling to make ends meet?" she wailed, though I knew for a fact they had just returned from a 2-week cruise to the Mediterranean. "Your father's health isn't what it used to be, and the medical bills are piling up," she continued, even though Dad had just completed a marathon the previous month and posted the photos all over social media. Their performance might have been convincing if I hadn't just read grandmother's journal entry from 6 months ago, detailing how they had been siphoning money from her checking account by convincing her to add them as authorized users for emergencies that never seemed to actually occur. That evening, as I sat in grandmother's study surrounded by her books and papers, I found more evidence of my parents' deception hidden in a filing cabinet they must have overlooked in their haste to search the house before I moved in. Bank statements showed regular withdrawals of $500 to $1,000 at a time, always just below the amount that would trigger fraud alerts, and receipts for expensive purchases that certainly hadn't been for grandmother's benefit. But the most chilling discovery was a business card tucked between the pages of a ledger bearing the name Barnaby Hutchinson Real Estate Developer, with a handwritten note on the back in my father's distinctive scrawl that simply said, "He's interested, just need to convince R to sell." The campaign to force me out of my inheritance began in earnest when Alicia announced her pregnancy at a family dinner I'd reluctantly agreed to attend 3 weeks after moving into grandmother's house. She waited until dessert was being served before standing up dramatically, one hand on her still flat stomach, to share what she called the most wonderful news of her life. "I'm 12 weeks pregnant," she declared, her eyes sliding meaningfully in my direction. "And Brad and I have decided it's time to build our forever home where we can raise our family properly, not in some cramped apartment like common people." What followed was a carefully choreographed presentation that would have impressed a corporate boardroom, complete with architectural drawings, contractor estimates, and a Pinterest board projected onto my parents' living room wall, showing every detail of Alicia's dream house. The custom-designed monstrosity she envisioned featured 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a home theater, a wine cellar she'd never used since she didn't drink wine, and an infinity pool overlooking the valley, all with a price tag of $600,000 that she mentioned repeatedly while staring directly at me. "Family helps family," my father intoned solemnly, as if reciting scripture, while my mother nodded along like a bobblehead doll. "Your grandmother would have wanted her great-grandchild to have the best possible start in life. And since you're sitting on $800,000 worth of property that's far too big for one person, the solution seems obvious to everyone here." The everyone he referenced included several aunts and uncles who had mysteriously appeared for this dinner, all nodding in rehearsed agreement as if they'd been coached on their lines beforehand. The pressure intensified when my parents casually mentioned their good friend Barnaby would be joining us for coffee. And in walked a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a sleazy real estate catalog, complete with an oversized gold watch, too much cologne, and a smile that never quite reached his calculating eyes. "What a beautiful family," he oozed, though his gaze lingered uncomfortably long on Alicia before turning to assess me like a predator sizing up prey. "I understand you've inherited quite a special property, and I happen to be in the market for historic homes to preserve and protect for future generations." His offer of $400,000 for grandmother's house was so insultingly low that I actually laughed out loud, which seemed to catch everyone off guard. The house needs extensive repairs. Barnaby claimed, smoothly pulling out a tablet to show fabricated estimates for problems that didn't exist. The foundation is cracking, the roof needs a complete replacement, the electrical system is a fire hazard waiting to happen, and don't get me started on the plumbing that probably hasn't been updated since the 1950s. Every word was a lie, as I'd had a thorough inspection done before moving in that showed the house was in excellent condition, but my family members gasped and tutted as if I'd been negligently living in a death trap. What they didn't know was that I'd done my own research on Barnaby Hutchinson and discovered some very interesting facts about his relationship with my sister that went far beyond a simple business arrangement. A private investigator friend had helped me uncover hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and credit card records showing Barnaby and Alicia had been meeting secretly for over 2 years long before her supposed boyfriend Brad had ever entered the picture. The timeline of their affair matched up perfectly with Alicia's sudden interest in real estate development and her mysterious ability to afford designer clothes on a retail clerk's salary. The sabotage began subtly at first, with small inconveniences designed to make living in grandmother's house as difficult as possible. I came home from work one day to find my water had been shut off, with my parents claiming they'd arranged for an inspection to help me out since I was clearly too overwhelmed to handle basic maintenance myself. The next week, the locks on the garden shed had been changed, and when I finally got them cut off, I discovered several valuable antique tools had vanished along with boxes of grandmother's correspondence I'd been planning to read through. My parents' daily visits became a form of psychological warfare as they brought along different contractors, each time men who were clearly Barnaby's associates rather than legitimate tradesmen who would point at perfectly sound walls and shake their heads gravely while muttering about imminent collapse and catastrophic failure. They spread rumors throughout the neighborhood that I was mentally unstable and unable to care for the property, telling concerned neighbors elaborate stories about finding me talking to myself in the garden or crying hysterically over grandmother's photo albums, none of which had any basis in reality. The social media campaign Alicia launched was particularly vicious, with carefully staged photos showing her clutching her tiny baby bump while standing outside rundown houses with captions like, "This is all my selfish sister thinks my baby deserves." And, "Some people value dead grandmothers over living children." The comment sections filled with outraged strangers calling me monsters, heartless, and worse, while extended family members who had never shown any interest in my life suddenly felt compelled to call and lecture me about family values and the importance of putting children first. My Uncle Gerald, who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years, left a 10-minute voicemail explaining how disappointed he was in my greed, conveniently forgetting that he'd tried to contest the will himself when he didn't receive the boat he'd been eyeing. Cousin Marie sent a long email detailing how grandmother would be rolling in her grave at my selfishness, though she'd never visited grandmother in the nursing home even once. The family phone tree worked overtime, spreading the narrative that I was a cold, calculating woman who would rather see her pregnant sister homeless than share the windfall I'd manipulated grandmother into leaving me. Through all of this, I held firm to my decision, installing security cameras around the property after finding my back door jimmied open one morning and several of grandmother's photo albums missing from the living room shelf. The cameras proved to be one of the best investments I'd ever made, though I couldn't have imagined just how valuable the footage they would capture would become in the dark days that lay ahead. I also began documenting everything meticulously, following grandmother's example by keeping detailed records of every interaction, every threat, and every suspicious incident, creating a paper trail that would soon become crucial evidence in ways I never anticipated. The breaking point came when I received a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of claiming to represent a creditor seeking payment for $50,000 worth of renovation work supposedly completed on grandmother's house just before her death. The letter threatened to place a lien on the property if payment wasn't received within 10 days, and attached were invoices with forged signatures that looked nothing like grandmother's distinctive handwriting, but might fool someone who didn't know better. It was clear the gloves had come off, and my family was escalating from manipulation and emotional blackmail to outright fraud in their desperation to steal my inheritance. The legal assault on my inheritance began with a thick envelope delivered by certified mail on a Tuesday morning that would have been ordinary except for the way my hands shook as I read the contents. My parents had hired Reginald Blackstone, known throughout the city as the lawyer you called, when you wanted to destroy someone through the court system, regardless of whether justice was actually on your side. The lawsuit claimed grandmother had been suffering from severe dementia when she changed her will, a complete fabrication supported by a doctor's note from a physician who had mysteriously retired to Costa Rica immediately after signing the document. According to the legal filing, I had supposedly exercised undue influence over my vulnerable grandmother, isolating her from her loving family and poisoning her mind against her own son through manipulation and lies. The document painted a picture of me as a calculating predator who had identified a wealthy elderly woman and systematically worked to steal her fortune, conveniently ignoring the fact that I had been grandmother's favorite since childhood and had spent every summer at her house learning to bake her famous apple pies and tend her prize-winning rose garden. The immediate impact of the lawsuit hit me harder than any physical blow could have when I realized I would need to hire my own attorney to fight these false accusations, draining my already modest savings account that I'd been carefully building since college. Patricia Winters came highly recommended, but equally expensive, requiring a $5,000 retainer just to review the case, with the warning that defending against a competent, albeit unethical attorney like Blackstone could easily cost 10 times that amount before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. While I scrambled to gather bank statements and credit card applications to secure a loan for legal fees, my parents escalated their attack on another front by targeting my employment. My father called my boss at the marketing firm where I'd worked diligently for 5 years, spinning an elaborate tale of concern about my deteriorating mental state, and suggesting that perhaps I needed to be placed on leave for my own safety and that of my coworkers. He claimed I'd been making threats against family members exhibiting paranoid behavior, and had even suggested I might become violent if confronted about my delusions. The HR department had no choice but to take such serious accusations seriously, and I found myself sitting across from the director the next day, trying to explain why my own father would make such outrageous claims while maintaining the professional composure that was rapidly becoming harder to fake. Despite my manager's support and my spotless employment record company policy demanded I be placed on administrative leave, pending a psychological evaluation, cutting off my primary source of income just when I needed it most to pay mounting legal bills and property taxes. That night, reviewing the security camera footage to prepare evidence of my mental stability for the required evaluation, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The infrared cameras had captured clear images of my parents using a key to enter through the back door at 2:37 in the morning, moving through the house with flashlights and apparently searching for something specific. They spent over an hour in grandmother's study, rifling through drawers and examining books, clearly looking for documents they believed I might have missed during my own exploration of her papers. What disturbed me even more than the break-in itself was the casual way they moved through the space, as if they'd done this many times before, which made me wonder how often they'd violated grandmother's privacy while she was alive and sleeping upstairs. I immediately changed every lock in the house and installed additional deadbolts, but the sense of violation lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. When I filed a police report the next morning, my parents claimed they were simply checking on my welfare because they'd been worried about my mental state. And without proof of criminal intent, the officers could only issue a warning about trespassing. The family ambush disguised as an intervention took place the following Sunday when I opened my door to find 15 relatives crowded on my porch, led by Aunt Martha, who had appointed herself the family's moral compass, despite her own history of borrowing money she never repaid. They pushed their way inside before I could object, filling grandmother's living room with their judgment and manufactured concern. Martha had even prepared a speech about how my selfishness was tearing the family apart and putting poor, pregnant Alicia's health at risk from the stress I was causing. "We're here because we love you," Martha intoned with all the sincerity of a television evangelist, while my cousins nodded along like trained seals. "This obsession with keeping the house has changed you into someone we don't recognize, someone your grandmother wouldn't recognize, and we're begging you to seek help before it's too late." The irony of being lectured about grandmother's wishes by people who had barely visited her in the last decade of her life would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. My sister Alicia took center stage for her performance, clutching her slightly rounded belly and allowing tears to stream down her face as she described the tiny apartment where she was forced to prepare for her baby's arrival, painting a picture of poverty that was completely at odds with the designer maternity clothes she wore and the luxury car she'd parked in my driveway. Every night I lie awake, wondering what kind of aunt would choose property over family. She sobbed while Barnaby stood behind her with his hand possessively on her shoulder, playing the role of supportive friend, even as his wedding ring caught the light. The financial warfare escalated when I discovered my parents had convinced me years ago to add them to a joint savings account for emergencies, which I'd forgotten about until I received an overdraft notice from the bank. They had drained all $20,000 I'd accumulated through careful saving, claiming it was compensation for the emotional distress I'd caused the family, and payment for the legal fees they'd incurred trying to honor grandmother's true wishes by contesting the will. The bank manager apologetically explained that as joint account holders, they had every legal right to the funds, regardless of who had actually deposited them. Without income from my job and with my savings stolen, I faced the very real possibility of being unable to pay the property taxes that were coming due, which would give my parents exactly the ammunition they needed to force a sale. I sold my car, grandmother's jewelry that wasn't specifically mentioned in the will, and even considered selling the antique furniture, though each item I parted with felt like another piece of my grandmother's memory being stripped away. The $10,000 I managed to scrape together would barely cover the next tax payment and a month of legal fees, leaving me wondering how long I could hold out against the sustained assault. The psychological pressure intensified when Barnaby filed multiple liens against the property for fictional renovation work, each with perfectly forged documentation that would take time and money to dispute in court. He had connections throughout the construction industry and had no trouble finding contractors willing to swear they'd performed work on the house, creating a paper trail that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't dig too deeply. Patricia warned me that fighting each lien individually could take months and thousands of dollars, money I simply didn't have anymore. Late at night, sitting in grandmother's kitchen where we'd shared so many conversations over tea and homemade cookies, I found myself wondering if maybe I should just give in and sell. The stress was affecting my health. I'd lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, and I hadn't slept properly in weeks, jumping at every sound and checking the security cameras obsessively. My few remaining friends had grown tired of hearing about the family drama, and I felt increasingly isolated in my battle against people who seemed to have unlimited resources and absolutely no conscience about destroying me to get what they wanted. But then I would remember grandmother's final video message, the strength in her voice as she explained her decision, and the trust she had placed in me to protect her beloved home from exactly this kind of greed and manipulation. She had seen what I was only now beginning to understand about my family's true nature, and she had tried to protect me the only way she could by leaving me not just a house, but a fortress against their toxicity. I owed it to her memory and to myself to keep fighting even as the walls seemed to close in around me and the legal bills continued to mount with no end in sight. The dusty attic had always been off limits during my childhood visits to grandmother's house, which made exploring it as the new owner feel like entering a forbidden treasure room filled with decades of carefully preserved memories. I'd ventured up there initially to check for any roof damage after a particularly severe thunderstorm, but what I found hidden behind a false panel in the wall would change everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's final years and the depths of my family's deception. The panel itself was cleverly disguised, painted to match the surrounding walls so perfectly that I only noticed it because a draft from a crack in the roof had caused it to pop slightly open. Behind it sat a fireproof safe that I'd never seen before, along with several boxes wrapped in plastic and labeled in grandmother's distinctive handwriting with dates from the last 2 years of her life. My hands trembled as I worked the combination she'd taught me for her jewelry box, the same one she'd used for everything important based on my birth date and the address of this beloved house. Inside the safe, I found a treasure trove of evidence that grandmother had been meticulously collecting, including a digital voice recorder with over 100 hours of recordings, photographs, with timestamps, bank statements with suspicious transactions highlighted in yellow and medical records that directly contradicted the dementia claims my parents were making in court. But it was a manila envelope marked, "For a line when the time comes," that made my heart skip a beat as I recognized the weight of what my grandmother had entrusted to me. The recordings were dated chronologically starting 2 years before grandmother's death, when she had apparently begun to suspect something was wrong. In one particularly chilling recording, I heard my parents discussing their financial problems in what they thought was a private conversation in the garden, unaware that grandmother had placed a recorder in the window box above them. My father's voice was clear as he said, "The old woman can't last forever, and when she goes, that house will set us up for life, especially with the development potential Barnaby mentioned." My mother's response was even more callous, suggesting they could help things along by adjusting grandmother's medication schedule, increasing doses of her sleep aids to make her more confused and dependent. "If she seems addled enough, we can get power of attorney and handle the sale ourselves," she mused while my father worried about making sure I stayed out of the way. Their casual discussion of elder abuse and potential murder made me physically ill, and I had to pause the recording several times to compose myself. Another recording captured a conversation between Alicia and Barnaby from 6 months before grandmother's death, confirming their affair had been going on much longer than I'd suspected. They discussed their plans to develop the property into luxury condos once they got their hands on it, with Alicia laughing about how she'd convinced our parents that she deserved the house more than I did because she was willing to share the profits. "Aline's always been grandmother's little princess," she sneered. "But money talks louder than affection when push comes to shove." The photographs in the safe showed my parents entering the house at odd hours when grandmother was at her weekly bridge club, and several images captured them carrying boxes out to their car. Cross-referencing with grandmother's meticulous inventory lists, I realized they'd been systematically stealing valuable items for months, replacing them with cheap replicas they assumed no one would notice. The missing Tiffany lamps, the genuine Persian rugs swapped for machine-made copies, and even several first-edition books from grandmother's collection had all been documented and photographed before they disappeared. Perhaps most damning was the private investigator's report grandmother had commissioned just 3 months before her death. A thick folder containing surveillance photos, financial records, and background checks on everyone involved in the conspiracy against her. The investigator had uncovered that Barnaby Hutchinson wasn't just a shady real estate developer, but a serial con artist who had left a trail of elderly victims across 3 states, all of whom had mysteriously decided to sell their valuable properties at below-market rates before suffering accidents or sudden health declines. The report revealed that Barnaby had been married 4 times, each wife significantly older and wealthier than the last, and all had died under questionable circumstances after signing over their assets. One had fallen downstairs despite having no history of mobility issues, another had overdosed on medication she'd been taking safely for years, and a third had drowned in her own bathtub. The investigators noted that while nothing could be definitively proven, the pattern was disturbing enough to warrant extreme caution advice grandmother had clearly taken to heart. The medical records painted an even more sinister picture, showing that grandmother's health had been excellent until my parents convinced her to switch doctors to someone they recommended, a physician who happened to be Barnaby's golf buddy and had a history of inappropriate prescriptions for elderly patients. Her medication list had grown from 2 simple maintenance drugs to a cocktail of 15 different prescriptions, many of which had dangerous interactions that would cause confusion, dizziness, and memory problems, creating the exact symptoms of dementia my parents were now claiming she'd exhibited. Most shocking was a video grandmother had recorded just 1 week before her death, sitting in her bedroom, looking directly at the camera with clear, determined eyes that showed no sign of confusion or impairment. "If you're watching this, Aline, it means they've finally succeeded in killing me," she began matter-of-factly, and I had to sit down as the weight of her words hit me. She went on to detail everything she'd discovered about the plot against her, naming names and providing specific examples of theft, fraud, and attempted murder that she'd documented over 2 years of careful investigation. I know they've been increasing my sleep medication, she continued in the video, her voice steady despite the terrifying content. I've been pretending to take it, but spitting it out later, though it's getting harder to avoid their watchful eyes. Last week, they tried to get me to sign papers while I was supposedly drowsy, but I managed to sign them illegibly enough to invalidate anything legally binding. She held up several documents to the camera showing obviously forged signatures that looked nothing like her actual handwriting evidence. My parents had been practicing her signature for fraudulent purposes. The video will was properly witnessed by two neighbors who had been grandmother's friends for decades, both of whom provided their contact information and expressed their concerns about the way my parents had been isolating grandmother from her social circle in her final months. They testified on camera that grandmother had been sharp as a tack during the recording, discussing current events and even beating them at poker. The same evening, completely destroying any claims of mental incompetence my parents were trying to establish in court. Building my case suddenly became much simpler with this wealth of evidence, though the emotional toll of discovering the full extent of my family's evil was overwhelming. I spent hours organizing everything chronologically, creating multiple copies of all recordings and documents, and sending sealed packages to Patricia, my lawyer, as well as to a trusted friend in another state for safekeeping. I also uploaded encrypted copies to multiple cloud services, paranoid, but justified in my fear that my parents might try to destroy the evidence if they learned of its existence. The safe also contained a letter from grandmother addressed personally to me, written in her elegant script on her favorite lavender stationery. My dearest Aline. It began. I'm so sorry you have to learn about your family's true nature this way, but I couldn't let them destroy you the way they tried to destroy me. You were always the light in my life, the only one who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could give you. This house is your inheritance, but more than that, it's your sanctuary from those who would harm you. Use what I've gathered to protect yourself, and never doubt that you deserve every bit of happiness and security this home can provide. I realized then that grandmother hadn't just left me a house, she'd left me a fully loaded weapon against those who had plotted against her and were now targeting me. The question was whether I'd have the strength to use it, knowing that doing so would mean the complete destruction of my family as I'd known it, and criminal charges that could send my parents and sister to prison for the rest of their lives. As I sat in the attic surrounded by evidence of betrayal and attempted murder, I knew grandmother had already made that choice for me by trusting me with the truth. The trap was set on a humid Thursday evening when my mother called with an unusually sweet tone that immediately put me on guard, inviting me to a family reconciliation dinner at my house the following night. She claimed they'd realized how wrong they'd been to pressure me and wanted to apologize properly, even suggesting they'd be willing to drop the lawsuit if we could all just communicate like civilized adults. Every instinct screamed danger, but I agreed, knowing this would likely be their final desperate attempt to force my hand. I spent Friday preparing for battle, strategically placing my laptop to livestream the entire event to a cloud storage service Patricia could access, hiding backup recording devices in various locations, and making sure all my security cameras had fresh batteries and clear views of every entrance. I also invited my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to be on standby next door, with her phone ready to call police if she heard any disturbance, though I didn't tell her exactly what I expected to happen. The evidence from grandmother's safe was secured in a safety deposit box at the bank with copies distributed to multiple secure locations. The family meeting arrived like an invasion force at precisely 7 o'clock, with far more people than my mother had mentioned would be attending. Through the window, I counted at least 30 individuals gathering on my lawn, including relatives I hadn't seen in years, several of Barnaby's construction associates who looked more like hired muscle than contractors, and even some people I didn't recognize at all who were probably there to serve as witnesses to whatever fiction my family had concocted for the evening's performance. My parents led the charge through my front door without waiting for an invitation, their faces set in expressions of grim determination that bore no resemblance to the reconciliation they'd promised. Behind them, Alicia waddled dramatically, playing up her pregnancy for maximum sympathy, while Barnaby guided her with a protective hand on her back, his other hand clutching a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained whatever legal documents they'd prepared to force me to sign under duress. "We're done playing games," my father announced, abandoning all pretense of civility as the crowd filled grandmother's living room, their presence feeling like a violation of her peaceful sanctuary. He slammed a folder onto the coffee table with theatrical force. These are the papers transferring the deed to a trust that will benefit the entire family, not just one selfish individual who has torn us all apart with her greed. The documents were already filled out, requiring only my signature to hand over everything grandmother had fought to protect. My mother's performance reached new heights of manipulation as she clutched her chest and staggered dramatically. "The stress of this situation has given me heart palpitations," she moaned, though I noticed she was careful not to disturb her freshly styled hair as she collapsed into a chair. "The doctor says I could have a heart attack at any moment if this continues, and your father's blood pressure is through the roof. Are you really willing to kill your own parents over a house?" Alicia took her cue to begin sobbing hysterically, claiming she'd been having contractions from the stress and might lose the baby if I didn't immediately sign the papers and end this nightmare. "You're murdering my child," she wailed, pointing an accusing finger at me, while Barnaby rubbed her shoulders and glared at me with undisguised hatred. "Every day you refuse to do the right thing is another day my baby suffers from your selfishness. How can you live with yourself?" The crowd of relatives began hurling their own accusations, creating a cacophony of guilt trips, threats, and emotional manipulation that would have broken me if I hadn't spent the previous evening reviewing grandmother's evidence and steeling myself for exactly this kind of assault. Uncle Gerald shouted about family loyalty, while Aunt Martha quoted Bible verses about honoring thy father and mother, conveniently ignoring the parts about not bearing false witness or coveting thy neighbor's possessions. "Sign the papers now," Barnaby commanded, stepping forward with barely controlled aggression. "Or things are going to get very unpleasant for you. I have connections you can't even imagine, and there are ways to make people disappear that look like accidents. Your grandmother learned that lesson too late, but you still have a chance to save yourself." The threat was so blatant that several of the relatives looked uncomfortable, though none of them spoke up to object to the obvious intimidation. When I continued to refuse, steadfastly stating that I would never betray grandmother's wishes, Barnaby grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, trying to physically force me toward the papers. "You stupid little girl," he snarled, his mask of civility completely abandoned. "Do you think you can stand against all of us? We've destroyed stronger people than you, and we'll bury you in legal fees until you're begging us to take this cursed house off your hands." The physical confrontation escalated when my father overturned grandmother's antique writing desk, in rage, sending papers and precious mementos flying across the room. My mother began throwing grandmother's collection of crystal figurines against the wall, each crash punctuating her screams about ungrateful children and the shame I'd brought upon the family. Alicia collapsed dramatically on the sofa, clutching her belly and moaning that she was definitely in labor now, all while Barnaby continued to twist my arm behind my back. The neighbors had clearly heard the commotion because within minutes police sirens filled the air, and uniformed officers pushed through the crowd on my lawn. Mrs. Chen had called them the moment she heard glass breaking and voices raised in anger, bless her protective heart. My parents immediately shifted into victim mode, claiming I had attacked them when they came for a peaceful family discussion, while Alicia performed her pregnant woman in distress routine for the officer's benefit. "She's mentally unstable," my mother told the police, tears streaming down her face with practiced ease. "We're just trying to help her, but she became violent and started throwing things at us. Look at my poor pregnant daughter who she assaulted." The relatives nodded along, ready to corroborate whatever story my parents had crafted, creating a unified front of lies that might have been believed if not for one crucial detail they'd overlooked in their arrogance. "Officers," I said calmly despite the pain in my twisted arm and the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "I have security cameras throughout this property that have recorded everything that's happened here tonight. Would you like to review the footage?" The change in my family's demeanor was instantaneous, faces draining of color as they realized their entire performance had been captured in high definition from multiple angles. The police reviewed enough of the recording on my laptop to see Barnaby grabbing me, my parents destroying property, and the threats that had been made against my life. They immediately separated everyone for questioning while calling for backup to handle the large crowd. Patricia arrived within 20 minutes, having been monitoring the live stream from her office, and racing over as soon as she saw the violence escalate. She carried with her printed screenshots of the most damning moments and a legal brief she'd already prepared anticipating exactly this scenario. "I'm pressing charges," I announced firmly, my voice carrying across the chaos of police officers taking statements and family members trying to coordinate their lies. Assault, breaking, and entering, destruction of property, criminal threats, and attempted extortion for starters. I also have evidence of elder abuse, fraud, and possibly murder that I'll be providing to the district attorney's office first thing Monday morning. The stunned silence that followed was more satisfying than any physical victory could have been. My parents' bravado crumbled as officers placed them in handcuffs. My mother's designer outfit looking decidedly less impressive, accessorized with metal restraints. Barnaby tried to flee, but was tackled by an officer in the front yard, his face grinding into grandmother's carefully maintained flower bed in poetic justice. Alicia's fake labor pains miraculously disappeared when paramedics arrived and found no signs of distress, leading to her being arrested for filing false medical reports in addition to conspiracy charges. As police cars filled with my arrested family members pulled away from the house, I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's home, surrounded by broken glass and overturned furniture, but finally free from their toxic influence. Several relatives slunk away into the night, suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere, while others mumbled apologies and admitted they'd been promised money to participate in the confrontation. Uncle Frank stayed behind to help me clean up, confessing that my parents had borrowed $15,000 from him with promises of repayment once they got the house. The immediate aftermath was both exhausting and exhilarating as I gave my full statement to detectives, provided copies of the security footage, and began the process of cleaning up the physical and emotional destruction my family had wrought. Patricia stayed until midnight, helping me document every broken item and reviewing the charges we would be filing. She assured me that with the evidence we had, including grandmother's recordings and the night's violent footage, convictions were all but guaranteed. The wheels of justice ground slowly but inexorably forward as the district attorney's office reviewed the mountain of evidence I'd provided, eventually announcing a grand jury investigation into my grandmother's death that sent shockwaves through our community. Detective Harrison, a veteran investigator with kind eyes and a methodical approach, spent hours reviewing grandmother's recordings and documents, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation about the depths of my family's conspiracy against a vulnerable elderly woman. The autopsy results, ordered based on grandmother's own video testimony predicting her murder, revealed what we'd all feared but needed confirmed in black and white medical terms. Her system had contained lethal levels of sleeping medication, mixed with drugs she'd never been prescribed, creating a cocktail that had slowly shut down her organs, while making it appear she'd died peacefully in her sleep. The medical examiner testified that without the specific request to test for these substances, they would have gone undetected, just as my parents had planned. Media attention exploded when reporters discovered Barnaby's connection to similar cases across multiple states, turning what had started as a family dispute over inheritance into a sensational story about a serial predator who targeted elderly women with valuable properties. News vans lined the street outside grandmother's house for weeks, and I had to hire security to keep curiosity seekers and amateur investigators from trespassing on the property that had become infamous overnight. The other victims' families began reaching out, sharing their own stories of sudden deaths and properties sold below market value to shell companies that all traced back to Barnaby and his associates. Martha Williams from Arizona had lost her mother and childhood home in exactly the same pattern, right down to the fake construction liens and family members who'd been mysteriously supportive of quick sales. Together, we formed an informal support group, finding strength in shared trauma and determination to see justice served. My parents' arrest made the front page of every local newspaper with headlines like, "Son and daughter-in-law charged in elderly woman's murder," accompanied by their booking photos that showed them looking nothing like the respectable middle-class couple they'd always pretended to be. Their bail was set at $2 million each, which they couldn't afford without the house they'd killed to obtain, creating an ironic form of justice that grandmother would have appreciated. The trial itself became a marathon of revelations, each day bringing new evidence of the conspiracy's scope and the callousness with which my family had planned grandmother's death. Prosecutor Catherine Shaw methodically built her case like a master architect, starting with the financial fraud and building to the ultimate crime of murder for profit. She played grandmother's recordings for the jury, letting them hear in my parents' own voices how they'd discussed helping things along, and their frustration that grandmother was taking too long to die naturally. My testimony lasted 3 full days, during which I detailed years of manipulation and the escalating abuse that had culminated in grandmother's murder. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter daughter, seeking revenge for imagined slights, but the evidence spoke louder than any character assassination could. When they played the security footage of my parents breaking into the house and discussing where to search for documents, several jurors visibly recoiled at the casual violation of privacy and property. Alicia's defense strategy of claiming Barnaby had manipulated her fell apart when prosecutors presented their 2-year affair's paper trail, including text messages where she'd gleefully discussed spending her inheritance before grandmother was even sick. Her pregnancy, which she'd weaponized so effectively during the confrontation, became a liability when DNA testing revealed Barnaby was the father, not her supposed boyfriend Brad, who testified he'd never actually been intimate with her during their relationship. Barnaby's past victims testified via video link, creating a pattern of behavior that was impossible to ignore or explain away. Each woman told eerily similar stories of charming older men who'd appeared in their mothers' lives, followed by mysterious illnesses and pressure to sell family properties. The prosecutor's closing argument connected all these dots into a clear picture of serial murder for profit, with my parents as willing accomplices who'd sold their own mother's life for the promise of easy money. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder for my parents and Barnaby, with Alicia convicted of conspiracy and fraud. The judge, clearly disgusted by the calculated nature of the crimes, imposed maximum sentences across the board. My parents received 25 years to life, effectively ensuring they'd die in prison, just as they'd planned for grandmother to die in her bed. Barnaby got life without parole due to the multiple victims across state lines, while Alicia received 15 years with no possibility of early release. The civil trials followed quickly, with grandmother's estate suing for damages and recovering hundreds of thousands of dollars my parents had stolen over the years. Their house was foreclosed and sold to pay restitution, while Barnaby's assets were frozen and distributed among his various victims' families. I donated my portion to elder abuse prevention organizations, knowing grandmother would have wanted her story to help protect others from similar predators. The most satisfying moment came when the construction liens against grandmother's house were vacated, and Barnaby's associates faced their own fraud charges for filing false claims. The house title was cleared of all encumbrances, finally and fully mine, without any shadow of legal challenges hanging over it. I stood in the courthouse hallway after that final hearing, holding the clean deed to grandmother's house, and feeling her presence beside me, finally at peace, knowing her killers had faced justice. Some family members reached out after the trial, expressing shock at what had been revealed and apologizing for their participation in the pressure campaign. I accepted their apologies, but made it clear that relationships broken by such profound betrayal couldn't be easily repaired. Trust, once shattered by greed and violence, doesn't regenerate simply because the guilty parties are behind bars. Uncle Frank became the exception, his genuine remorse and consistent support earning him a place in my rebuilt life. The legal victory felt hollow some days when I walked through grandmother's house and remembered all the happy times before I knew what monsters lurked behind familiar faces. But I also remembered her strength in documenting their crimes, despite knowing they were slowly killing her, and I drew inspiration from her courage. She had trusted me not just with her house, but with the truth, and I had honored that trust by seeing justice through to the end. The silence in grandmother's house after the trials felt strange at first, like the calm after a devastating storm when you're not quite sure it's safe to emerge from shelter. I found myself wandering from room to room, touching familiar objects, and trying to reconcile the peaceful space with all the violence and betrayal that had swirled around it. The broken figurines had been swept away, the overturned furniture righted, but invisible scars remained on both the house and my heart. Therapy became my lifeline in those early months of recovery, helping me process not just the recent trauma, but years of manipulation I'd been too close to see clearly. Dr. Sarah Martinez specialized in family trauma and betrayal, guiding me through the complex emotions of grieving people who were still alive but dead to me in every way that mattered. "You're mourning the family you thought you had," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "And that's just as valid as grieving someone who's physically gone." The guilt hit unexpectedly, washing over me at random moments, like when I'd cook grandmother's recipes or tend her garden. Should I have seen the signs sooner and protected her somehow? Could I have prevented her death if I'd been more aware of my family's true nature? Dr. Martinez helped me understand that predators like my parents and Barnaby succeeded precisely because they exploited normal family bonds and trust, turning love into a weapon against their victims. Returning to work proved challenging, but necessary both for financial stability and emotional recovery. My employer had been following the trial coverage and welcomed me back with understanding and support. My colleagues treated me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity, but I found that being honest about my experience helped demystify the situation and prevented whispered speculation. I even gave a presentation to our HR department about recognizing elder abuse, turning my trauma into education that might help others. The house itself became my healing project as I slowly renovated each room, not to erase grandmother's presence, but to blend her memory with my own vision for the future. I kept her reading nook exactly as she'd left it, complete with her bookmark, still marking her place in an Agatha Christie mystery. But I updated the kitchen with modern appliances while maintaining its vintage charm. Each improvement felt like a conversation with grandmother, asking her opinion and feeling her approval in the way sunlight hit certain windows. Creating a chosen family became essential to filling the void left by biological relatives who'd proven themselves unworthy of the title. Rachel, my college roommate who'd stored copies of evidence for me, moved into the guest suite after her own apartment lease ended. Her presence brought life and laughter back into the space, replacing echoes of angry voices with movie nights and shared dinners. Mrs. Chen from next door became an honorary grandmother, joining us for Sunday dinners and sharing stories of the neighborhood's history. Uncle Frank's journey toward redemption proved that not all family connections had to be severed forever. He attended every therapy session his counselor recommended, working to understand how he'd been manipulated and enabled the toxic dynamics. His apologies came not through words, but actions, helping me sort through grandmother's belongings, sharing positive memories, and respecting boundaries when I needed space. Slowly, carefully, we built a new relationship based on honesty rather than obligation. The support group for families affected by elder abuse grew from informal meetings to a registered nonprofit organization that I co-founded with Martha Williams and other victims' families. We provided resources for recognizing warning signs, legal assistance for those fighting exploitation, and emotional support for survivors struggling with guilt and betrayal. Grandmother's story became a cautionary tale that helped other families protect their vulnerable members, transforming our tragedy into prevention. I visited my parents once in prison, needing to see them behind bars to fully accept the reality of their crimes. They sat across from me in orange jumpsuits, looking smaller and older than I remembered, still maintaining their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. My mother tried manipulating me one final time, claiming she'd been protecting me from something worse, while my father simply stared with cold eyes that held no remorse. I left that visiting room knowing I'd never return, closing that chapter with finality. Alicia's letters from prison went straight to the shredder unopened after the first one revealed she still blamed me for ruining her life. She'd given birth in custody, with the baby immediately placed for adoption, probably the best chance that innocent child had for a normal life. I felt no obligation to maintain any connection with someone who'd participated in our grandmother's murder, regardless of shared DNA. Family, I'd learned, was defined by love and loyalty, not blood. The foundation I established in grandmother's name focused specifically on preventing inheritance fraud and elder abuse, providing free legal consultations, and helping elderly people create safeguards against predatory relatives. We funded safe houses for seniors escaping abusive situations and supported legislation increasing penalties for those who victimize the elderly. Every person we helped felt like a small victory for grandmother, proof that her death had meaning beyond our family's tragedy. 1 year after the trial, I hosted a memorial garden party in grandmother's honor, inviting everyone who'd shown genuine support during the ordeal. The house overflowed with friends, neighbors, colleagues, and fellow survivors who'd become my true family. We shared stories of resilience, raised glasses to grandmother's memory, and celebrated the strength found in standing up to those who would exploit our love. The garden bloomed with new life, including a rose bush I'd named Justice for Rose, that produced stunning crimson flowers. Standing in that same spot where my parents had screamed and demanded I surrender my inheritance, I marveled at the transformation. The house that had been a battlefield was now a sanctuary filled with people who understood that love meant protection, not exploitation. Grandmother's portrait smiled down from the mantel, and I could almost hear her saying she was proud of how I'd honored her trust and protected her legacy. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflection, and I opened it to find a young woman who introduced herself as a journalist, writing a book about elder abuse and inheritance fraud. She wanted to include grandmother's story with my permission to help other families recognize the warning signs before it was too late. I invited her in for tea, settling into grandmother's reading nook to share the full story, knowing that every telling helped prevent another family from suffering our fate. Some people ask if I regret not just selling the house and avoiding all the pain and conflict that followed. But grandmother taught me that when you stand up to bullies, you don't just save yourself, you save the next person they would have targeted. My parents' screams that day weren't really anger about the house, they were the sound of predators being denied their prey, of masks finally falling off to reveal the monsters beneath. This house isn't just my inheritance, it's proof that love and justice can triumph over greed and betrayal. The sun sets through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors that have witnessed so much history. I'm not the naive 28-year-old who inherited this house anymore. I'm a survivor who learned that family isn't about blood, but about who shows up when you need them most. Grandmother's house stands strong, a fortress not just of walls and memories, but of truth and courage. And in the end, that's the greatest inheritance she could have given me. What would you do if your own family tried to steal your inheritance through manipulation, and worse? Have you ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who put greed above love? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of standing up to family betrayal and finding justice against all odds. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics. Thank you for joining me in honoring my grandmother's memory, and remember, sometimes the best family is the one you choose for yourself. Until next time, stay strong and never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what's rightfully yours.